All right, everybody, I believe we are live. Welcome to the Unapologetic Apologists, episode 16. I'm super excited to have my next guest. If you're unaware of him, check out his YouTube channel, his Facebook page, Inspiring Philosophy. Michael Jones, thank you so much for being here, sir.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So the first question I always ask people is how you came to faith, what was that journey like, and then what ultimately got you interested in apologetics?
Well, it's a long story, and it's not as exciting as some are. Like, I wasn't addicted to drugs or anything like that. Basically, I was raised as a Christian. I got picked on a lot at church, didn't like it, and attached my negative feelings with that towards Christianity. I actually went to the hospital one time because I got a concussion at church. So that tells you about how I felt about church. So I eventually started studying some things to try, because I didn't like Christianity. So I was, trying to find things to sort of just justify my hatred of Christianity. Unfortunately, though, I probably just was either lucky or unlucky, however you look at it. And I came across like pre-Zeitgeist websites talking about, Jesus mysticism and whatnot. Now, I had already been really into like mythology just for the fun of it before this. And so when I started reading people claiming that Jesus was a copy of Horus or Dionysius, I was like, that's nonsense. I know that's nonsense. Like, that never fazed me because I was like, I just know this is wrong. So what I saw at that age was like a lot of the attacks on Christianity were bad. Now, maybe if I had found like a Bart Ehrman or Maurice Casey, that may have gone different. But in my phase, it didn't. So somehow someone convinced me to read some of C.S. Lewis books, and that presented a very intellectual side. Eventually, I came across tectonics.org as well, and that presented an intellectual side as well. So for me, it was like a long process going back and forth. Some days I'd wake up, I'd feel more like Christianity was true. Some days I didn't. Kind of became a Christian that way. Shortly after I became a Christian, someone got me into Kent Hovind, which was a bad idea. But he comes across as quite confident, and he's a good salesman. So I thought there might be something there. Unfortunately, a lot of his claims didn't hold up, and then I kind of went back into the whole. Some days I wake up feeling like it was true, some days it wasn't. And from there, it just was a lot of studying and working and trying to figure these problems I had out. And it took a while. I don't know if there was ever a day where I had like some sort of religious experience. It was just a long process. But that's also the reason I got into apologetics, was just struggling with my own questions and trying to find answers and just trying to tackle them all from an analytical standpoint.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I was kind of similar. I mean, I was raised as a Christian, and I was always kind of told about, well, you have to have a relationship, and then you'll feel the Holy Spirit. You'll have these experiences, and I never had that kind of emotional experience. I was depressed a lot as a teenager, and I always thought, well, if it's supposed to help me emotionally, it's not doing that. And it wasn't until I got into apologetics and realized, okay, there's intellectual answers for why I might suffer and not feel like God is with me, and that was enough for me.
Right. It's different for every person. I get that. It just, I never had like a religious experience or an emotional experience. It was always for me just kind of like, well, the facts are leading me here. I'm going to study the evidence and see where it gets me there. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like, oh, I'm just so unbiased. It's so cool. Obviously, there's some bias and personal feelings in everyone's beliefs. But from my experience and how I kind of went through, that's how I kind of got here.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, everyone has biases. Again, I was raised as a Christian, so that was kind of my bias. But I will say, like, ever since a really young age, my mom did put an emphasis on truth and seeking truth, even if it's uncomfortable, even if you don't like it. And so that's something that's just always stuck with me till now. And I'm more than happy to change my mind when I think I'm wrong about something and I'm presented with evidence. And so, yeah, I'm biased, but I do my best to check it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I agree.
So yeah, when I first got into apologetics, what was it, about 7 years ago? 7 years ago, Kent Hovind was the main guy, too. And now, obviously, now looking back, I realize how much I disagree with him on. But at the time, I will say I had stuck with him a lot because using his arguments, I destroyed like a lot of the college atheists I was debating. And so
really, I had the opposite effect. I used his arguments and I got crushed. It's like they just were like, They're like, no, he's wrong about carbon dating. That's the reservoir effect. Here's a paper. And it's like, oh, crap. Yeah, I had the exact opposite effect with him. I tried to use his arguments and I got creamed to the point where I was so angry at one point at atheists, at him, at myself. Like, I just felt like I had been bamboozled. And I was just like so mad.
Yeah. Well, so for me, I mean, for like, I want to say maybe the first year or so, I was just when I first went to college and I had first discovered apologetics was a thing. I was so excited, so I was debating all these guys, and yeah, I was pretty much tearing down their worldviews, probably just because they weren't very studied on their stuff. And there was one particular friend I had who was an atheist, and so after about a year of debating all these other atheists and baiting them with their arguments, he all of a sudden, me and him kind of developed a relationship and had these conversations regularly, and he started kind of tearing that worldview apart for me. And so by the end of that whole process with him, that was what I had to kind of go back down to the bottom, and then I started studying guys like William Lane Craig and Frank Turek and all these guys, and so I did have to start rebuilding it, but I guess I just got lucky for that first little bit.
I guess so. Yeah, I did horrible. Of course, I debated online, though. I didn't really debate in person. And when you debate online, it's easier to look up references and whatnot. I did really well debating the resurrection, reliability of the New Testament, refuting the whole pagan myth crap, because that's when Mithra and Horus was really big, because it was when Zeitgeist had come out recently. But when it came to evolution, I just got the crap kicked out of me. So I was in a conundrum. I was like, the resurrection argument is pretty solid. New Testament reliability, very good arguments there. But this creation stuff, I don't know what to do with it. It's not holding up to scrutiny. And so then I eventually got into a little bit of Hugh Ross's ideas, and I'm like, okay, that explanation could work. I'm not sure if I fully like it. And then I eventually found Michael Heiser and John Walton, and then I was like, now pieces are falling together. I kind of see how to understand this within its ancient Near Eastern context, and that's when I really felt solid within that view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's funny you say that, because one of the things for me, it was when I did start kind of rebuilding the worldview, it wasn't that I stopped being a young earther at that time. Like, I didn't just start off going, well, I'm an old earther now, but I did start off kind of going, well, you know what? I've been debating these guys about the age of the earth and about evolution and stuff, and I realized we never get to Jesus. So for me, I kind of started taking the approach, well, I don't care when the universe began to exist. The fact is, it began to exist, and that book points to a beginner. And then I started getting into the evidence for Jesus, because I realized that's where my focus should have been. And then, yeah, when I started learning more stuff from guys like Hugh Ross, who I really like, I did start being, the science isn't quite where I thought it was. I'm actually having Kent Hovind on later this month.
Oh, geez.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. I because of that kind of debating atheists and stuff, I do kind of have a sentimental reaction to him mainly. And I mean, here's the thing with a lot of guys, and I'm going to do this with atheists too, is I just want to give them the floor, make their case, and the audience I trust them to be smart enough to parse through different people I interview and different, arguments they give and make up their minds. But you did bring up the Zeitgeist movie. I'm surprised at how many people still bring that up, and it's one of these things I talked to John McCrae about, which is atheists, they go back to old, really bad arguments. And it's like they kind of just recycle the same old terrible arguments. And Zeitgeist, I mean, those pre-Christ resurrection myths were debunked in like the late 1800s. And then...
Well, yeah. I mean, they weren't debunked per se. They were just shown that they lacked total evidence and total connections to Christianity. And it wasn't about that. It started to really come out around maybe in the mid 1900s or so, because James Fraser tried to make some connections to dying rising gods about 100 years ago. And then other scholars came along and sort of tore that up and said, this is not connected to Christianity at all. And now the debate among scholars is, were there even any dying and rising gods? But, it's funny, if you read Mark Smith, he says, no, there weren't any dying and rising gods. If you read Trygve Medinger, he says there were some dying and rising gods, but they both agree this has nothing to do with what Christianity was talking about. These were seasonal dying and rising gods, if they existed, connected with vegetation cycles. That's a different category than Jesus or Jewish ideas of resurrection. So the debate they're having has nothing to do with Christianity now. It's a totally different thing.
Yeah. Well, what do you make of that? Because I'm one person. I never like to attribute motive, right, to somebody. I like to just kind of deal with somebody's arguments if you think they're good or bad or whatnot. I never like to attribute motive. But what do you make of, like, I don't know, Mithras, for example? We know that there was nothing really similar between Mithras and Jesus, and the stuff that is similar is actually copied from the early Christians and then attributed to the Roman Mithraic cult, and then people kind of do this reverse engineering. But if stuff like that is such bad history, how does it become like popular scholarship?
Well, let me just read from a scholar today named Jan Bremer, because he basically says in his conclusion of his he has a book called Initiation into the Mysteries. And in chapter 6, he basically says they were ideologically motivated. So a lot of these early ideas, he says, modern research, on the other hand, has shown that the constructions of scholars around 1900 were ideologically motivated and were wrong in 3 important respects. And so first, the idea there was mystery religions, the idea that Christians were copying them, and he kind of goes through all these ideas. So it was ideologically motivated. There were some bad motivations that were sort of causing this idea that they claimed Christianity was a mystery religion and Jesus was just another version of Osiris, or not so much Mithras, but maybe the Attis cult, or Baal. That's another one that comes up, or Tammuz, these types of deities. So, I mean, there was some bad motivation there, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and unfortunately for guys like us, it takes kind of a little bit to unpack all that. But it's really easy for someone on the other side to just put a list of all these gods and then just say, born December 25th, died, raised from the dead, had 12 disciples, yada yada yada, and go down the list.
Oh my God, that's half of my job, is just debunking. It amazes me how many times atheists or skeptics could just say stuff, and people just go, "Oh wow!" And then if you're a Christian, you got to do like endless scholarly research to debunk them, because you just can't trust us. Where are your facts? Get your evidence together. But they'll just make all these ridiculous claims, and that's good enough. Maybe I'm just seeing it from my perspective, but it just seems like this is what I always end up dealing with, is just having to do like endless amounts of research on like Asclepius, because some atheist one time said something about Asclepius.
Yeah, that's why I don't debate on Twitter, because it's really easy to raise like 10 objections in 150 characters that takes way more than that to debunk. And, I completely blanked on what I was about to say.
It's just ridiculous. No matter what, man, it's like they could just make all these claims. Like, well, Jesus was just another copy of Asclepius or Baal. I mean, and I remember reading Richard Carrier's blog, and he says this type of stuff, and he cites Mettinger's book, The Riddle of Resurrection, a lot. Well, I've read that book. Read through it, highlighted it, have a whole PDF right here on my computer. And sometimes Carrier says stuff, and I go and I look at the page, and I'm like, that's not what he's saying. Like, why? But he puts it out there. People just believe it. I'm like, come on. Like, really?
Well, yeah, and it's attractive too, because for someone who's already an atheist, or maybe an agnostic who leans towards atheism, or somebody who just like wants to sound intellectual, you don't have to do a lot of work to just memorize real kind of these catchphrases and these slogans, and just it doesn't take a lot of work, and you can sound really intellectual by just memorizing all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, one of the things I tell Christians and apologists is that half the time you just got to ask them for their source. And a lot of people don't think to do that. They feel like they have to debunk everything they say by going through these things. Sometimes just ask them for their source. So I've done a couple of videos on my channel where I point out that holidays like Christmas, Easter, Halloween, soon to be Valentine's Day, don't have any pagan origins. So when people come on my channel saying it is, all I do is I go, well, what's your source? Do you have a primary source I can read, maybe a scholar? And not 99% of the time I don't get anything. I just get, insults and, hand waving. And the same thing I do with the pagan gods. I go, what's your source? And typically I'll get, well, here's Richard Carrier's blog. And I'm like, well, what source does he have? Did you actually fact check him? Because there's a lot of problems with some of the things he said. And I love when people reference David Fitzgerald's books. I've read David Fitzgerald's books. There's a lot of bad referencing in there. I mean, it's not good.
Yeah. Richard Carrier is he's not the typical guy. He's one guy who I actually will say I wouldn't debate, and it's not necessarily that I'm not afraid to debate anybody, But his approach is, I honestly wouldn't know how to deal with it, how he just kind of goes in. Like, did you see the debate he did with William Lane Craig?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a little dishonest.
Well, so personally, I just don't know how to come back when he can point to all these kind of things like, well, Barabbas, here's a name that originates here and here, and we can understand why it'd be here, but it would also be made up if it was from the New Testament.
Yeah, that's such a nice even see atheists that are not even Jesus mysticists bringing up the Barabbas thing. I mean, one thing we have to remember is it does mean son of father, but we do have references to the name Abba as a proper name in that period. I mean, Craig Evans talks about this. We also have references on Jewish ossuaries to the name Bar Sabbas, which means son of the elder. So we have references to people named Abba. We have references to Bar Sabbas. It's not that far-fetched to understand some guy was calling himself Barabbas. It just fits with the cultural context. And this idea that it's a copy of the Yom Kippur, you have Barabbas who goes out, and you have Jesus who's another son of the Father who's crucified. I'm not so much convinced of the Yom Kippur reference, because if that was the case, the text would record that Barabbas would have left Jerusalem and ran away from the city. It doesn't. It says Barabbas was brought into the people, like among that we want Barabbas among us. So I don't think it really connects that well to the Yom Kippur. And what happens is, because humans are pattern-seeking creatures, that's how we evolved. We tend to like, oh yeah, look, he is finding patterns. That's very interesting. But it takes a little bit more work to notice, well, yeah, you can find some similarities, but when you start to look at it, it doesn't match exactly entirely. And just because there are similarities, that just might be the authors, doing the same thing that the modern Jesus mysticists are doing, which is just finding patterns and trying to highlight them on purpose to show something. I mean, it's overblown what it actually means.
Yeah, and it goes back to kind of like the Zeitgeist thing, which is, even if it were true, it doesn't actually help prove the point. Like, just because all these patterns originated beforehand doesn't mean it's automatically false when you get to the New Testament. And it's one of the things J. Warner Wallace points out, which is like, when it comes to all these pre-Christ resurrection myths, like, best case scenario for the atheist, let's say all these people did come before Jesus and it was claimed that they had all these similarities to him. At the end of the day, either the evidence for the New Testament or for the resurrection of Jesus is good, in which case we should believe it, or it's bad, in which case we shouldn't believe it, regardless of what comes before.
Right. I always point out the fact that scholars are well aware of connections. I mean, I remember reading Bob Price. He basically spends several pages showing like allusions in the New Testament to the Old Testament to show clearly Jesus was a myth and copied from it. And scholars have been aware of these connections for years, and they know, yeah, we would expect that, because ancient authors did this a lot. I mean, Virgil does it with Caesar Augustus. He's always trying to say, well, Caesar did this. Now I'm going to find a parallel in Roman mythology to write about it to make this connection, because humans are pattern-seeking individuals. It was an ancient custom to paint reoccurring scenes or events in already existing patterns from the past. So if they could find any connection to Moses when writing about Jesus, they were going to highlight that. That doesn't mean they made it up. It means they saw Jesus do something. They're like, oh, that reminds me of Moses. I'm going to make the connection. People do that today. How many church sermons have you been in where some guy gets up there and he's like, I felt like Daniel in the lion's den? I mean, it's a wasted exercise by Jesus mysticists, and they don't realize that it is.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was about to shift right. So kind of shifting topics all of a sudden here. I did want to ask you about Genesis, because kind of as we talked about, we kind of, Kent Hovind was like kind of the first guy we went to, and then after that we kind of moved on to this other stuff.
Oh, and I didn't go to him. He was thrust upon me by someone else, and I got fooled.
I apologize for that. No, so where was I going with that? Right. So for me, kind of where I stand now is I'm convinced the science supports the old universe model. Mm-hmm. I still have trouble with the scripture, though, because typically when I hear people trying to make the argument that scripture can allow for billions of years or this kind of stuff, it always seems like they're stretching their arguments a little too far. It seems like they're kind of doing kind of mental gymnastics with things to kind of make the days sound like longer periods. But when you debated Kent Hovind, you expressed a view I actually hadn't heard before, and that sounded like it could be going somewhere. And so it sounded almost like a middle ground, which is, well, actually these are 6 literal days. Nevertheless, there's kind of this period beforehand, and these kind of 6 days are establishing, like, kind of. Correct me where I misrepresented it there.
No, you're getting it. Did you see my 2 most recent videos on Genesis 1? Because I elaborate more on those 2, and I explain basically what we have here is we just have a basic temple inauguration view. It's talking about how when God sort of like decides to make the cosmos his temple where he's going to reign in. So that's the basic view you have of Genesis. And so I kind of elaborate in those two videos and explain the details in there. But it indicates that the opening lines of Genesis 1 indicates that this happens at a point in time. It's not the absolute beginning of time. And so, because the Hebrew reads more like when God began to bara the heavens and the earth was unproductive and waste. And so, that signifies God coming in at a point in time and inaugurating his temple within 7 literal days.
Mm. And so your view would be something like Moses, when he's writing Genesis, isn't concerned with the age of the earth or the universe. It's just more he's getting this revelation of just that 6th day establishing everything.
Right. Yeah. Ancient people didn't care about where space, time, and matter came from. It's not in any Egyptian creation myths. It's not in any other ancient creation myths. They care about when gods began to order things or name things or structure things properly. So Genesis fits within that same cultural context. And if that's the case, it doesn't care about where space, time, and matter came from. It doesn't care where the first humans came from. Because remember what Genesis 1 does. Genesis 1 talks about humans as a whole. God inaugurates them to be his image. Okay, and then Genesis 2, starting in 2:4 really is when Genesis 2 starts. But it says, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth. And that's an interesting clue, because that phrase shows up about 11 times in Genesis. These are the generations of Terah. These are the generations of Ishmael. And every time that phrase comes up, it always introduces what happens after that person. So that would imply Genesis 2 is a sequel, not a recap. It's a sequel of what happens after the creation of the heavens and the earth. So that would mean when Adam and Eve are brought into the scene, it happens after humanity is given the imago Dei, and there are all these humans that would existed prior to Adam and Eve being given the priest and priestess of within Eden. So you got to keep that in mind. It's people. A lot of young Earth creationists want to say Genesis 2 is like a recap of like the ending verses of Genesis 1. That doesn't fit with the context. Anytime you see the phrases in Genesis that these are the generations of, it tends to signify the sequel, what comes after that person, what follows after that person. And that's what's probably happening in Genesis 2. This is a sequel to Genesis 1. And that would not mean Adam and Eve are in view when God is talking about humans in general in Genesis 1.
So, okay, so I'm not sure I follow all of that. So your view is in Genesis 1, because God makes man and woman in Genesis 1, right? I'm not remembering that wrong.
It says, let us make man in our own image.
In our image. And so your view, that's not Adam and Eve?
No, because there's a definite article there. And you don't apply definite articles to names. So when it says, let us make Adam in our own image, it's referring to humanity as a whole. Adam and Eve are not in view yet. There's no garden there. Then it says, these are the generations of, to signify chapter 2. This is the next phase of God's step. This is the next phase of the story in Genesis. And then he plants a garden. He puts 2 individuals in there who are going to have these special roles of priest and priestess. But they come onto the scene after Genesis 1 is already over. So God is talking about humanity already existing as a whole there, and he's allowing them to be his image there. So that needs to be put into view. And so it's not a recap. It's talking about Adam and Eve as a sequel now.
Okay. So let me play devil's advocate a little bit with this.
Go for it.
Because, and not that I want to open the whole can of worms of evolution, but you have said you're a theistic evolutionist, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I don't even hold back on that. Yeah.
Okay, no, I didn't expect you to. But so, again, to play devil's advocate, even in Genesis 1, you have God, he makes the fish and the birds, and then he makes the animals, and then he makes man in our image. That it doesn't necessarily sound like that would be consistent with this gradual process. If let us make man in our image seems like a sudden creation, it doesn't seem the same as kind of developing, starting to get upright, and all this kind of stuff. You know what I mean?
You should have watched my recent video called Genesis 1b.
I have both of those bookmarked, by the way. I just haven't gotten to them.
So I basically explained it in there. Okay, so let me quote Michael Heiser. He's quoted in the video. He's talking about this. The verse 127 is verb dominated. He says, if we think of imaging as a verb or function, that translation makes more sense. We are created to image God. That's what it's literally saying in the Hebrew, to be his imagers. It is what we are by definition. The image is not an ability we have, but a status. We are God's representatives on earth. To be human is to image God. So the image of God in Genesis 1 is not a creation point. It's literally a call of election. It's God saying, I want humanity to image me. And that would mean, it means the exact same thing it means in the New Testament, when Paul says we are called to conform to the image of his son. So there's parallels there between Christian theology and Genesis theology. God has called it humanity to image him. In the New Testament, Jesus calls Christians to image him. So it's the same sort of parallel. And if you read like J. Richard Middleton, John Walton, Michael Heiser, just about every scholar I've read who's written on the Imago Dei, they know this is not a creation point. This is a call of election.
Okay. And so then what about like the forming of the dust, breathing into his nostrils, the breath of life?
Good. So this will be my next video. My next video will be on it will be out in August. This is maybe the next video in the series. I have one more to do in between that, or two more really, because the other one's up on Patreon right now, but it will be up on Public Friday. So Genesis 2, so the whole dust thing. First thing I say is there is not a person alive who takes all of Genesis 2 literally, and I can prove that quite easily, because how does it end? Genesis 2:24, it says, a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh. Okay, no one takes that literally, and I pointed this out in my debate with Ken Hovind.
Ken Hovind took it literally.
He does. He becomes one flesh.
Please still come on my show.
Yeah. But yeah, it's impossible to take all of Genesis 2 literally, and Genesis 2:24 should be a clue for how we are to understand this passage. All right, it's talking about real people, because I think Adam and Eve are real people, but they're being described in archetypal patterns or in metaphorical language, because the marriage union is described in metaphorical language. You can't ignore that. So that's a very obvious clue, and that's the context. So when we're talking about Adam, it says, God Yatsard Adam. It doesn't actually say from next. It doesn't say God Yatsard Adam from dust to the earth. The preposition is missing. It says God Yatsard Adam, dust of the earth, and then breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and he became a living nefesh. Now, thinking of that and connecting that back to the end of the chapter when it says marriage union, the Hebrew phrase breathe, breathe into his the Hebrew phrase breath of life. That's the only time it ever appears anywhere in the Bible. We see other times the phrase breath of life shows up in the English translation, but if you look at the Hebrew, it's not the same phrase. So this is the only time this phrase shows up. Now it says he becomes a living nefesh. And the word nefesh, we think, means soul. That's not really what it means. So Robert Alter has just published his Jewish translation. I just got it. It's like 3 books long. And it's incredible. But he argues nefesh doesn't mean soul. This was a modern Western misunderstanding of what nefesh means. It has a couple different meanings. Like it means the breath in your throat. But Richard Hess, in his book Israelite Religions, notes what it mainly refers to is a person's vitality or their desire to live. So it's kind of like what drives a person, what gives them purpose. And he refers to places like Proverbs 16:26, Deuteronomy 23:24, Exodus 23:9. He also draws to Leviticus 17:11. And he says it's written in a way, and I quote, that the nefesh describes that element of a person that chooses life, seeking it and experiencing it. So Adam becomes a living nefesh. He is given he becomes a living, vital being as he now has this new purpose to live. And that would make sense with what follows. Because what happens is Adam is then placed in the garden, given new tasks. He's now a priest over creation. So it makes sense he now has a new vitality to live for. He has a new nefesh. And so I think that's what it's basically saying is God called Adam, who was dust of the earth, because that's an idiom for mortality that shows up other places in the Bible. So God calls this mortal man, gives him a new nefesh, a new purpose or vital reason to live, which is to work in the garden. So I'm going to go over a lot of this more in detail when I publish my video on Genesis 2. I need to get it reviewed right now, and I'm in that review process, but things are looking pretty good so far.
So what would be your view on when the soul enters the arena, because the typical belief is, for example, like animals don't have souls like humans do, and so if we're talking about the gradual process of evolution, and if making man in the image of God isn't necessarily that imparting of the soul onto humanity, where do you see that coming into play?
Well, see, we have to first define what we mean by soul. So, what do you mean by soul?
So, as a dualist, I mean the immaterial me that interacts with the physical me.
Are you defining it the same as like you would spirit?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, cool. That's a good place to start. I don't think that's how Paul defines soul. I think because he says he talks about mind, body, and spirit, or soul, body, and spirit. I think soul more or less means the mind. It's your emotions, your personalities, your thoughts, your dreams, your hopes, your desires. That's what your soul is, and that's how I think Paul uses it in the New Testament. I think what you're more getting at is spirit. So the soul, by that definition, does evolve over time. You're not the same person you were 10 years ago. Your soul has sort of evolved. Your personality changes. So if that's how I understand soul, I would say, yeah, animals have soul. This guy has a lot of soul. So, I mean, for me, I would say animals do have a soul.
Okay. So then I'll just slightly shift my question: is where's the spirit come into play?
Right. Well, and I did talk about this in the recent video as well. The Bible never makes any ontological distinction between humans and animals. So it uses the same verbs when it talks about creating. It uses the same word for spirit when talking about animals and humans. Same with nephesh. Same with body. It never ever makes an ontological distinction. So it says that animals, the word we translate as spirit, also is used of animals as well. So the Bible seems to indicate that animals are basically like us in the same ontological way. They have a soul, nephesh, a spirit, a body. They're barad, just like we are. So I talked about in my most recent video on Genesis 1. So the Bible, I don't think ever makes any ontological distinction between humans and animals. And Ecclesiastes 3:18 and 20 goes so far as to say that, I pray that, man shall realize he is a beast of the field. It says right there, quite frankly, that we're also beasts, but the only difference is we're just far more intelligent.
So what are your views on the spirit then? Like, do you believe that, like, are you a dualist?
I'm an idealist. So I'm a dual aspect idealist in that sense. That's my basic view. When I talk about the spirit, I would say it's like the underlying consciousness for which the soul is contingent upon. So it's like it would be the conscious mind. I think that's what Paul is describing when he talks about spirit. And then your soul, your personality, thoughts, dreams, emotions are all contingent on that. And then the body is also connected to that as well. But I would call these more like epistemic distinctions, not so much ontological distinctions.
Okay, so tell me if you disagree with this. So my view is, essentially my consciousness, as you just said, is an immaterial being, and my brain, my body is more or less the tool that my spirit uses to interact in the world. Right. And if that tool fails or dies in some way, then that spirit doesn't die, and then that's what goes to either heaven or hell.
No, I agree completely. I mean, okay. when I talk to substance dualists, I say, look, we agree on everything. I just point out, I would just say that these are information or epistemic distinctions, and you say they're ontological distinction. That's it. And so I'm not so much against substance dualists. I just think the underlying connects to just one. I just would argue it's just one substance, and that's why I'm an idealist. And I have different videos where I explain that.
Okay, so real quick, one question that's in the live chat here from Jose Martinez says, what are inspiring philosophy's thoughts on physicists like Sean Carroll, who would say that the universe is probably eternal? And before you answer that, I want to add a little bit of some because that is related to a question I was thinking of. So the typical view on Genesis and the Big Bang is, it says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and a lot of people point to that and say, well, see, the Bible predicted the beginning even when atheists thought the universe was eternal. And then the evidence for the Big Bang comes out, and atheists fight against it because it gives too much credence to the Bible. But you were just talking about how the proper interpretation wouldn't necessarily be in the beginning. It would be when God created the heavens and the earth. And so, like, would that possibly allow for an eternal universe within the biblical text?
It possibly could. Especially when you look at the ancient Near Eastern context, they tended to think that just there was this eternal watery chaos idea. Now, when Sean Carroll talks about the universe being eternal, he doesn't mean classical space-time. So it's hard to deny that classical space-time has a beginning. I agree with Sean Carroll when he says this kind of stuff, that there's eternal. What he's saying is the universe. He's more or less defining as reality, and I would say yes, reality is eternal. So I did a video called "The Emergent Universe," and I sort of explained the underlying quantum information, which just sort of points to the idea of a mind that the universe is emergent from. So Sean Carroll said this underlying quantum realm that's extended through Hilbert space is eternal. And I go, yeah, exactly. And that's the mind of God. And so I explained this in my video, The Emergent Universe. And I even quote Sean Carroll in there to support my case. So yeah, I'm like, yeah, good work, Sean Carroll. Now look at the philosophical implications and whatnot. And I remember one time he was in some sort of interview where he's like on the coast somewhere, I think in Japan. And he even mentioned, like, we have to be careful with quantum physics because it could, give too much credence to, the observer connection to like the observer. And, he didn't want to do that because he holds like the many worlds interpretation, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I use some of the stuff Sean Carroll says in my case to argue for God's existence. So I think it's just kind of ironic when that happens.
Okay. Yeah, it's funny you say eternity, or not, reality is eternal, because we believe God is the ultimate reality. And so
yeah, so when some atheists have come to me, they've given me models. They've said, I have found this model where our universe is emergent from a more underlying reality, or a larger possible realm. And I go, let me get this straight. You're saying that our universe is contingent on something eternal, and you think that's a problem for the Bible? And they never reply. They realize what they just did, and they're like, oh crap. Because if you are arguing that, yeah, we found this more underlying eternal reality, which our space-time emerges from, I'm going to go, yeah, exactly. It's like, what do you want?
Yeah. So what do you think, what do you make of atheists like Tom Jump's claim that, sure, we can go with some kind of necessary ultimate reality, but it could just be naturalistic pantheism, and that would be a lot less arbitrary and ad hoc than a person?
Yeah, I just go watch my debate with him and just watch him squirm. That was so fun. Did you see my debate with him on Modern Day Debate?
I did.
Yeah, it's like halfway through, I just kind of like, I'm just gonna let him keep talking because he's gonna keep burying himself. But I specifically gave him 3 arguments that argue for a conscious mind. One of my arguments was specifically arguing from consciousness. So if the arguments directly imply a conscious mind, naturalistic pantheism doesn't explain the evidence, and it's insufficient. So it doesn't work. Now, if he wants to say, well, it's just some sort of natural substance that's mimicking consciousness, well, now you're getting ad hoc. Now you're multiplying entities beyond necessity. If it looks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, if it talks like a duck, it's probably a duck. If it implies a conscious mind, it probably is a conscious mind. We don't have to, presuppose naturalism is already true, so it has to be some sort of naturalistic explanation regardless.
Yeah. One of my favorite parts of the debate, and I don't mean to attack him while he's not here. Tom Jump is a friend of mine. He's going to be on the show soon. But one of the things I found interesting is you kept pointing out, he kept saying, well, we can't get at metaphysics. And you kept pointing out, well, that's a metaphysical claim. And his claim was it wasn't a metaphysical claim because what he was talking about was our epistemic knowledge, right? And that we can't get at the metaphysical. The problem is you can't make that claim without also making a simultaneous claim about the metaphysical, because what you're talking about is a relationship between our epistemic knowledge and the metaphysical. And if you're saying this can't reach this, well, you're making a claim about this that it's somehow beyond the reach of this, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was a great explanation. I mean, it just, these people who try to make these absolute distinctions between like science and philosophy or epistemology and metaphysics, they don't know what they're talking about. These subjects are so blurred together. I mean, you cannot do science unless you first understand philosophy of science. You've got to know your epistemology if you want to do metaphysics, and vice versa. They're interconnected in so many ways. So when people make claims like that, I already know they don't know what they're talking about, because this has been addressed so often in philosophy. It's just ridiculous now.
Yeah. So, speaking of debates, I did want to ask you about your debate with Aron Ra, because to steal a joke from Steven Crowder, did you get checked afterwards because you went in deep? So before we get to this debate itself, I did want to ask you about your preparation, because, me personally, when I hear something like someone tells me the topic I'm debating is Christianity dangerous, my mind immediately goes to, okay, I'll be talking about history, and I'll go to the West and Christian morals, and how it's created the West, and how it created the environment for the Enlightenment to take place, and all this kind of stuff. And then we're going to end up having a discussion about history and debating, well, of course Christians did bad things and all that stuff. You had a much more brilliant approach, and something he clearly wasn't ready for. What made you decide to go the route of science like you did?
Well, I was already familiar with some of the studies, and the debate was, is Christianity dangerous? So that's something we can actually study in social science. I also, as I mentioned at the beginning of that debate, there's the guy who runs the channel DRes83, now calls himself Rational Perspectives, knows a lot of that. He's helped me prepare for that as well, and he sends me studies, and we go back and forth talking about that kind of stuff. So I was already familiar with the literature. I debated Matt Dillahunty last year on the same subject, so I was already familiar with it, and I was already pretty much aware of the arguments Aron was going to make with regards to that. And so my basic thought was, well, we're going to debate Christianity. Let's see how it fares up in the scientific literature. So I just went directly to the scientific literature. Who cares what Christians have done in the past? That doesn't mean Christianity caused those bad actions by those people, because they could have been caused by other factors. I mean, they could have been caused by perhaps economic problems or cultural problems. I mean, you can't just say Christian do bad thing, therefore Christianity bad. That's a stupid argument. But a lot of atheists do that, and it's really bad. And I also see some sort of Christians doing it with Islam. And so I sort of caution against that. Show me a study first. We got to hold ourselves to the same standard we want to hold atheists to. So my approach was, let's just look and see what the science actually says. And that's what I did. I went into the science.
Yeah. And so when he was caught off guard at that, he wanted to change to, well, it's really about the evidence for Christianity. And if you don't have any evidence, if you're believing something despite all the evidence, that's going to be dangerous.
Yeah, that was him just basically admitting to the whole crowd that he couldn't answer my studies. He was not familiar with the literature, and he didn't have a good reply. So he just decided to say, well, I've already know that Christianity is dumb and incorrect and false. So why is it a good thing to believe something dumb and incorrect and false? It's like, really, that's what you're going to do? And I thought he would just do that, and I knew ahead of time I was not going to follow him down that route. I was just going to I was going to point out that's not the topic. You're assuming the conclusion you want. You're begging the question. Can we get back to the actual subject? Because, he did the same thing in past debates, and I wasn't going to let him do it to me here.
Yeah, it was a very brilliant performance. I did not know you debated Matt Dillahunty. I'm going to have to go look that up right after this and see it. How did he fare against you as opposed to Aron Ra?
I mean, he at least stayed mostly on the subject, but he kept making up weird hypotheticals. Like at one point, he was talking about how horrible it is that some areas of the world only have access to Christian hospitals and not non-Christian hospitals. And I just said, well, that just shows Christians are the ones going around building hospitals for people who don't have hospitals. And he didn't like that. And he was trying to argue that, like Catholic hospitals force funerals for aborted babies. And I'm like, where's your evidence they do this? And he didn't have any. And then around like the 1:18 mark, someone pointed out in the comment section that I basically got him stumped, because he had take a couple seconds where he just stepped back and think about what I had just said, and he didn't have a good reply to it, because I said I need a study for what you're claiming, and of course he didn't have one. So he used the same paper that Aron Ra used, that stupid paper by Gregory Paul that just does cross-cultural data, and then tries to say that religion is so bad because look at this. And so I addressed it in there as well, and I pointed out the problems, and then he never brought it up again. So I was really happy with that debate. I got a lot of good feedback from that debate. I don't have any gripes or complaints about it, really. I mean, I was pretty happy with it.
Right on. So one topic I did want to ask you, because it's been something I've been talking about lately, and it came up when I talked to Frank Turek, is the B theory of time. Because I've heard you say you're a B theorist. Now, my personal position is I'm an A theorist. I'm not convinced that the B theory is philosophically viable, and I'm not necessarily a fan of the theological implications I think it has. That being said, I'm very aware that there's a lot I don't know about it and a lot I don't understand about it, so I'm willing to be educated on where I'm wrong.
Okay. Well, if you check out a video I did called "The Emergent Universe," I talk a little bit about it there. So there's an equation called the Wheeler-DeWitt equation. Now, this is an important equation because they were calculating the wave function of the universe. And when they calculated the wave function of the universe, the time factor dropped out. Now, the universe is emergent from the underlying wave function, which is extended in Hilbert space. So what the universe is contingent upon is timeless, because the time factor drops out for the wave function, according to the Wheeler-DeWitt equation. Now, there was an experiment called Time from Quantum Entanglement, an experimental illustration, where they were also able to demonstrate this on the quantum level, that time is not necessarily a factor. And I talk about it a little bit more in that video, The Emergent Universe. And basically, time is an emergent construct within our space-time. And outside of that, there is no time. Now, that's hard to fathom. It is really hard to fathom, a timeless state. I totally get that. But the reason why I'm a B theorist is because the evidence leads me there. I don't want to appeal to consequences. Maybe the theological implications might bother me, but for me, I'm more interested in the evidence and then dealing with the consequences after that fact.
Okay, so here's where I'm getting a little confused. So the B theory, if I'm correct, is like sequential time isn't technically real. Like you and I, this present moment isn't actually privileged, for example, as opposed to the present moment of the apostles or the present moment of Moses versus the present moment of people who live 50 and 100 years now from us. I'm correct so far?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let me think of how to say this. I'm not sure that going from there we can even make the claim that the universe began to exist necessarily at any point. Because on the B theory, all the universe began to exist 13.8 billion years ago really means is this universal block extends 13.8 billion years in that direction, but the whole underlying thing, I don't think you can even make a claim about that beginning to exist.
Right, and I don't, because I say the underlying thing would be the mind of God. So I don't, in my videos, like this, when I present digital physics argument, I argue the universe is emergent. And so I don't have to argue beginning to exist. This is why I'm not a big fan of the Kalam either, I think, because the scientific evidence is pointing more towards the universe being emergent. Now, if it is emergent, that's a stronger case, I think, for theism. Because, if it's emergent, that means, it just didn't come into existence in a finite past. But literally all of the universe is emergent from something underlying and more fundamental. So I don't think it creates any problem for theism. I think it strengthens the argument when you start looking at what physicists mean when they say space-time is emergent.
So real quick, how would you distinguish emergent from began to exist?
Well, I mean, same with the A and B theory of time. The whole space-time block is emergent from an underlying, more fundamental reality. On A theory, you go far back in time, and then this material space-time would come into existence at a point in time. Now, there is also a paper I could give you that talks about the Kalam and B theory of time and how they can work together as well. So there have been people who have written about this.
Okay, let me think. So here are the bizarre theological implications for me. So one of my favorite books is God Over All by William Lane Craig, and that was Divine Aseity and the Challenge of Platonism. And he actually changed my mind in that book, because prior to that I was a divine conceptualist with regards to abstract objects. Were you about to say something?
No.
Okay, so I thought, okay, things like mathematics, laws, logic, they exist. They exist as concrete objects, but in the mind of God. Now, Craig persuaded me more towards a non-realist perspective, which is things like logical truths and mathematic truths are contingent upon God, but they don't actually exist. There is just such a thing as mathematical and logical truths because God exists. And if God didn't exist, then those truths just wouldn't exist. But kind of putting that aside, the whole book is defending God's divine aseity as the sole ultimate reality, which is, and the challenge of Platonism was, well, if God is the sole ultimate reality, you can't have things like abstract objects existing eternally with him. Mm-hmm. So for me, when I follow the B theory to its logical implication, the logical implication is that you can actually make a distinction between God's existing timelessly without the universe and God's existing with the universe. It seems that the path you ultimately end up going down is that the universe, though contingent upon God, exists eternally with him.
Well, yeah, from his timeless standpoint, it would eternally exist from his perspective. Yeah.
Okay, and so
I don't know what the problem with that is, though.
Well, so for me, that just challenges his divine aseity as the sole ultimate reality, because even though it's contingent with him, it poses the same problem that these so-called abstract objects do, because you have something else existing timelessly with God. And to me, it doesn't fix the problem to just say, but it's contingent upon his creative power.
Well, I don't see that as a problem, because it would all be, I mean, something being eternally with God doesn't mean it's like equal to him or in power to him. It would still be eternally contingent upon him or eternally emergent from him. Just like, you could argue epistemically, God's knowledge or God's wisdom, talked about in Proverbs, is eternally there and always contingent upon him. It's not some sort of additional thing that, could have like is, but I guess I'm having a hard time seeing the problem here. I don't see why something cannot exist eternally yet still depend upon God for existence.
I guess maybe it's just because, and maybe I should try to rethink some of this. I mean, I guess it's just coming from that whole defense against abstract objects, because in order for God to be the sole ultimate reality, you don't want other things coexisting eternally with him. And to me, well, if we're going to plug the universe in there, that seems problematic for at least that reason.
Well, I think when it comes to Platonism, what they're trying to do is they're trying to divorce God from those other objects. Like they exist eternally and God exists eternally, but they're not like necessarily contingent upon it, that kind of idea. Now, if you're someone like more like I lean more towards like scholastic realism, then you have these abstract truths that are eternal, but they're always contingent upon the mind of God. And so, for me, that doesn't really see as a problem. I think it's only if it's like the Platonic idea that you have like these perfect square, the perfect circle, the perfect Platonic objects that are eternal, and they're not necessarily contingent upon God. So I would only see that as a problem if you take the strong Platonist view.
Okay, fair enough. So my second theological objection to this is so, for example, God. So from our perspective, it's an A theory, regardless of it being a B theory, right? And so from our perspective, God enters human history at separate, distinct moments. So, for example, when he entered as the burning bush, when he entered as a man in front of Abraham, then when he enters as Jesus and he suffers on the cross. And then at the end of the world, he'll create the new heavens and the new earth, and then he'll be enjoying fellowship with us, his creation, right? And so I take the perspective that God actually does experience distinct present moments. And so for example, there was a point in God's experience when the incarnation of Jesus was something he would do. He hadn't done it yet. He would do it. He would enter human history and he would suffer. Now, from God's perspective, that's something he already did, and he doesn't have to do it again. And then so when he's experiencing fellowship with us in the new heavens and the new earth, he can do that, and that's kind of divorced from the suffering in a sense. But when we operate under the B theory of time, and then going even further, saying that B theory universe kind of is co-eternal with God, even though contingent on him, it puts all those moments for God at once. So God is simultaneously entering the garden with Adam and Eve. He's simultaneously with Abraham, suffering, and in the new creation with us.
Yeah, that's one thing that is brought up often, and I don't think the objection really gets to it, because if God is a conscious agent, that doesn't necessarily mean he has to always be experiencing all these moments in time necessarily. So if God is sort of like holding like time on his hand like this, like the timeline here, he he can also allow himself to go through time with us, but also have his eternal essence be outside of time. A good analogy might be sort of like a supercomputer, sort of like the big server on the outside. Yet within there, you could have maybe like an AI that always has access to that knowledge, but can also interact with humans on the outside and sort of go through their experiences with them. So I think we need to remember something that's used in like Greek philosophy, which is the energy essence distinction. The essence of God is this eternal, timeless substance for which all things are upon, and yet, Jesus. But there's also the energies of God. And that's the imminence of God. That's God's interacting with us. He interacts with us through His energies, and so it's talked a lot about. And Philo of Alexandria, then Clement of Alexandria talks about it. And later, you get people like Gregory Palamas talking about this. And so when you talk about that, I mean, God can be transcendent and yes, imminent. That's what they're trying to explain, the transcendence and the imminence of God at the same time. And I would look at like the timeless nature of God as the transcendent form, but imminent, how he relates, how he goes through time with us can also be his imminence form. So I don't really see that as a problem because it assumes that God has to sort of be like just an essence, and he can also have energies as well. So that's where I kind of draw the distinction.
So maybe I'm just misunderstanding you, but so for me, the whole way this came up is me and my friend were basically having an argument. He was saying God remains timeless after the creation of the universe. I was arguing that God becomes temporal. And my main argument was that God does experience distinct present moments. And so, and again, maybe I'm just misunderstanding this, but it seems you're acknowledging that God does experience distinct present moments, but that would seem to suggest to me that he's at least experientially speaking temporal, and that would support an A theory of time, of reality, even if like that seems to suggest to me that God is temporal, and the A theory is the ultimate reality true, but then this kind of universe exists as a B theory block.
Well, I would, when you were arguing with your friend, I would just, if I was there, I would have said, why not both? I mean, that's kind of what I think.
I'm just not sure. Put it this way, I pressed him on it, and I pressed Frank Turek on it, and it doesn't seem that you can reconcile the two, is just from the discussions I've had so far.
Well, give me an example. Why don't you think you can reconcile the two? Because I would say that, God can sort of, here's a good analogy. How can God be God and also become human at the same time? Why, Jesus is God while he is human. When he was 3 years old, he was still God, and yet he's also fully human. How can God do that? Well, I mean, he's transcendent and immanent at the same time. So when I think of like the connection between A theory and B theory of time, God experiencing time with us, but also transcendently eternal, timeless, I just go to the incarnation, because there's the perfect analogy right there. God is both human and God at the same time. I don't see that as a problem for the same reason I don't see the incarnation as a problem.
So I don't see the incarnation as I don't see God being fully God and fully human as two contradictory states. I see God being completely timeless and also temporal as two contradictory states.
Why?
Well, because if he's experiencing sequential moments, if he's temporal in that sense, that he's not simultaneously timeless. And then,
well, no, I mean, he could experience temporal moments in the same way that he could also be a transcendent being. So, I mean, it goes back to the imminence. The theologians talk about the difference between imminence and transcendence. How can God be both transcendent and imminent at the same time? So, that's where the distinction is. And so, God can experientially be going through time with us, like entering into the cosmos, experiencing the cosmos with us, but he can also be a transcendent being that also is beyond space-time. So maybe a better analogy for you would be, how can God both be in space-time and also beyond space-time?
Well, so that's actually, I would completely agree with that. That's one of the points I was making to my friend, because he kind of thought I was committing the fallacy of saying, well, God is in and subject to our space-time. And I still hold that God is beyond that. Nevertheless, that you could call it divine temporality if you want. But to me, that divine temporality, God is leaving behind that timeless state. I definitely want to pick this up in a further discussion, but I know you're almost out of time, so I want to quickly end on a separate note, not necessarily disagreement. So play devil's advocate real quick. What do you think would be the best argument for atheism? Not even necessarily one you've heard, although it could be one you've heard. But like, if you were going to be an atheist and you had to come up with the best argument for it, what would that look like?
Well, it depends. You mean my best argument against Christianity or my best argument against theism?
I'd be interested in both, but I know you don't have long, so maybe you could pick
See,
one.
I don't. Well, I got about another 5 or 10 minutes or so. My big thing. I mean, for Christianity, I would probably use the problem of evil, as I've mentioned in my videos. That's probably the biggest objection to Christianity. For theism, I'm not really sure because I don't know. I never was an atheist. Even when I was sort of against Christianity, I had a hard time being an atheist because I'm like, well, there obviously has to be some sort of God. I mean, I was basically arguing from basic moral or contingency arguments. And now, knowing all the evidence I know, it's really hard for me to say, well, how can you deny there's not at least some sort of conscious mind which created everything? Just look at the digital physics argument. I mean, there's just so much evidence there. I don't know what you want from me. I mean, I don't know. It's really hard for me to, if I ever lost my Christianity, I would just be a deist because for me, it's so hard to deny that at this point.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the best argument for atheism would be. Because it's there. It's like, I'm just like, sometimes when I'm talking to atheists, I'm like, why is it so hard to just accept deism? I mean, you admit you don't have a better explanation of this data that I have presented you. Why not be a deist? And I get the runaround typically.
Yeah. So, just real quick on the problem of evil. So, obviously, I know it's not technically coherent to say the problem of evil can disprove God, right? Because God, by definition, would be the standard of good, and then that would allow for the existence of evil. So you can't really have. But what do you think it's possible for someone to argue there's so much gratuitous suffering, and so you don't have to attach that moral label of evil to it? You can just call it there's so much gratuitous suffering that it seems inconsistent with a being that would be the locus of good if that thing existed.
Yeah, I mean, you could, if it's deism, I mean, you could say, well, he just doesn't care about us, that kind of thing, and just wants to run the experiment, see what happens. With regards to gratuitous evil, I did an hour-long video on the problem of evil back in January, and I cover a lot of that in there. But just in a nutshell, it's basically the gratuitous evil happens because humans exist. We're the causes of it, so God is allowing us to be the lords of our own life, to show us how horrible this existence is, in order that we will actually see that we need a savior kind of attitude. And I elaborate a lot more in my video on that.
All right. Well, that's great. So, guys, go check out his videos. Subscribe to his YouTube channel, Inspiring Philosophy. Are there any other plugs you want to get in?
I might, or I don't know if it's been announced yet, but for the Apologetics Academy, I'm going to be doing a class soon called The Reliability of Genesis, and I'll be presenting a lot of arguments you've probably not heard of that argue for the reliability in the a much earlier date for Genesis. So I'll be presenting that soon.
All right. Well, Michael Jones, it has been an honor talking to you, sir. We'll have to do it again soon. Thank you so much for being here, brother.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Take care, everybody.